We all love to dream up the perfect little change needed to make our favorite Final Fantasy XIV jobs perfect. Oh, if only Gunbreaker needed one less cartridge than they could hold, so it was easier to make it just right. Wait a minute. If only Holy had a shorter cast time so it was easier to work with. Hey, wait a minute. If only you could use Flare Star with less than 6 Astral Souls somehow. Okay, there's an idea, I guess. Anyway, what if we instead tried to dream up one single change that would ruin a job instead of making it better? And no, you can't just go, Potency of Fire 4 is now garbage, Lamau. Let's aim for something interesting. And be sure to let me know what you would do to ruin a job, or alternatively, how you like my suggestions, in the comments. Let's start with Paladin. Oath Gauge is now generated exclusively by shield-related actions. Shield Lob and Shield Bash generate 20 Oath Gauge per use. Blocking now generates 5 Oath Gauge, just like it did back in the day. On AoE packs, this could technically enable Paladins to have way more Oath Gauge to work with, but in all other situations, you're effectively forced to use your worst attacks just to have gauge to spend for defense. Unless you expect to rely on the random generation from blocks. But there is a logical reasoning for Oath Gauge being produced like this, I guess. For slightly less mean design, Holy Spirit could also generate Oath Gauge, which it also used to in Shield Oath. For Warrior, I wonder if you would see this one coming. Bloodwedding and Nascent Flash now cost 50 Beast Gauge. Would you like to have a Fell Cleave or your amazing healing cooldown? I mean, we could make the cooldown on Bloodwedding 5 seconds, just like with Holy Sheltron if that is desirable, but I don't think it would change much, considering the cost. The funniest thing about this, I think, is that I wonder how many warriors would gladly sacrifice Beast Gauge for their AoE immortality to stay. This would suck even harder before level 74, as you wouldn't be able to reliably generate much Beast Gauge on AoE, and before 70, you just might never have resources for a good Berserk window. Would you use Bloodwedding if it cost Beast Gauge? For White Mage, Afflatus Solace and Afflatus Rapture now only nourish the Blood Lily if over a certain amount of their healing is actually applied, and overhealing does not count. The funny thing about this one is that a lot of the time, you would be able to find ways to use the lilies just fine in time this way. Surely, you wouldn't use the majority of the lilies on entirely overhealing, but by specifically stipulating that you need to heal over a certain amount, not just non-zero amounts, and that the reward is only granted if done correctly, it could lead some players to use these lily spells less frequently than if there was no reward at all, out of fear of losing out on the reward itself. For Scholar, Embrace and Seraphic Veil now have a 2.5 second cast time, and EOS prioritizes players that need healing that have the least HP amount as opposed to percent. However, you can now use Embrace as a pet command to control who EOS is healing. You might think this sounds incredibly evil, but from my memory, this is approximately how Embrace used to work many years ago. A common strategy used to work around it was to sometimes use a macro to command EOS to cast Embrace on your target when you had to heal someone. However, let's just say this design means that if EOS is left to figure things out herself, she will waste most of the Embrace healing on players that don't really need it. It's like a funnel of endless healing just going out into nothing unless you keep directing it manually. Next up, Monk. Meditation no longer activates the GCD, but does have a recast time equal to your GCD. Yes, this would be a damage buff to monks, and probably a huge one at that. I mean, balance changes can come later, but what this would mean for monks is that every GCD you could weave meditation. At a glance, that sounds kind of funny, but simultaneously, this would mean that monks would be, at minimum, single weaving every GCD. Meaning, at its slowest, monks would need to use an action every second. For some players, this sounds like a silly thing to worry about, but the way this becomes tedious or outright annoying is that every other button you press will be meditation. This would be a curse disguised as a blessing. For Dragoon, Power Surge now only lasts 20 seconds. Let's assume the job is balanced around this nerf, meaning the job ultimately is just as strong as before when played right. This would, however, make Dragoon insanely annoying to play, as there would be an about 5-second window every loop of the 10-step sequence where the power surge buff would just not be there. And because the 10-step loop is sort of desynced from the timing of the burst windows, those 5 seconds will likely frequently land in the middle of a burst, and the only thing you can really do about it is use all the OGCDs as you go, and then in the drop, hold everything, and then once the buff is back on, you go back to blasting. Again, assuming the job is balanced around it, this would just be insanely awkward and annoying to play around. Also, since the chaotic spring dot duration is unchanged, resolving this by resorting to only chaotic spring combos would probably suck damage-wise. For Bard, this one is particularly weird. Repertoire is now exclusively activated by Imperial Arrow. However, the effect of Repertoire is now significantly more powerful to compensate. Mage's Ballad fully refreshes all stacks. Army's Paean jumps to 4 stacks immediately. Wanderer's Minuet goes directly to 3 stacks, or alternatively we could just say that it activates since 1 and 2 stacks would no longer matter. Soul Voice would be generated more heavily to match. Of course, potencies are balanced around this. What makes this particularly awkward is that, on the one hand, Imperial Arrow giving you complete control over when you get your repertoires makes their job almost entirely predictable. On the other hand, you now need to keep a super close eye on this specific cooldown, and optimal timings to use the repertoires. If you cannot Imperial Arrow right when Army's Paean starts, it sucks. If you're anywhere into the cooldown of Heartbreak Shot when you Imperial Arrow, you sort of have the feeling of losing value. Pitch Perfect doesn't really care, but we could easily make that a problem too. Next, Black Mage. Black Mage training now finally includes a gym membership. Their auto attack now hit harder than melee DPS auto attacks, going past 5,000 per swing. Enochian is nerfed to a lower percent to make sure Black Mage's damage is kept in line with other jobs. Mage auto attacks are generally put in such a position where they do so little at high levels that they might as well not exist. 1 damage is 1 damage, but if auto-attacking a whole fight equates to 0.001% more damage done, does it really matter? If, however, mages had relevant auto-attack damage, it would be equal to mages being less ranged than a paladin at times. The reason Black Mage should hit this hard is because the amount of casts would make the auto-attacks very infrequent. For Summoner then, your summons have become very shy and insist on hiding right behind you, otherwise they refuse to act. When you summon anything, they will always follow you around and will cancel what they're doing if they're not right next to you. For most summons, this does just require you to stand still for a second or two, but for others, well... Before the Summoner rework, a common problem with Summoner was that despite Phoenix being entirely instant attacks so you could run around, Phoenix would waste its time following you around instead of attacking. This also applied to Bahamut, although you had a bit less instant attacks there. The fact Ifrit, Titan and Garuda only stick around for so long also means a high mobility phase could mean you just don't get to use them at all. Fun! For some jobs, it is too easy, like with Ninja. Mudras and ninjutsus are once again off the global cooldown and can be weaved entirely between weapon skills, assuming you have the latency to do so. Potencies are adjusted, nerfed, to compensate for this massive buff. Some jobs used to have such mega jank in the past that we don't have to be creative, and instead can just fish it out of the history books. The main problems with this design is that, aside from Huma Shuriken, all ninjutsus required at minimum a triple weave to be performed. And 3 Mudra Jutsus required a quadruple weave. The fact Ninja's GCD is faster than normal means that even on the best connection, you would probably clip the GCD on Raiton. It just feels awkward. For Dark Knight, Dark Arts is now a gauge that goes from 0 to 3000, and TBN instead refunds a percentage of this bar based on how much of the barrier is still available when it expires. Anything that spends MP will take from this gauge first, including TBN itself. You heard that right. This means you get more MP refunded the less useful TBN was. You may be thinking, excuse me, are you intentionally making all the short defensives for tanks bad? Yes, I am. It's the funniest way to ruin them, obviously. On the other hand, it is way easier to generate Dark Arts MP by protecting the TBN than it is to look for damage for it to take. So technically, this is a defensive nerf disguised as a really roundabout small damage buff, if at all. Machinist is next. The cooldown of Drill, Air Anchor, and Chainsaw are increased by 2 seconds. Potency is above to compensate. Why 2 seconds? Why? Because if it was 2.5, it would actually align nicely with the GCD, assuming no skill speed, of course. But this way, there's no way for Air Anchor or Chainsaw to align nicely with the GCD anymore. They will always be janky. Drill just sort of got caught in the full metal field, as it were. For Astrologian, Astral and Umbral Draw have been replaced with a trait learned at level 30 that does the following. Every 20 seconds, 15 seconds once Minor Arcana is learned at level 70, a random card from the pool of 6 or 8 cards is drawn. You can hold up to 3 cards, 4 when Minor Arcana is learned, and can spend them in any order you wish. This might actually be crazy overpowered for Astrologians, but the fact that 5 out of the 8 cards are entirely defensive in nature means that on average, you'll be drawing a lot more healing and defensive options, and those that played Astrologian before the Dawntrail rework will probably recognize how you'd always get Lady of Crowns over and over and over when you didn't want it. Yes, you could accumulate 4 damage buff cards, or even 4 Lord of Crowns for the burst, but good luck doing that consistently. The MP recovery could just be put on the playing of the cards themselves. Onward to Samurai. Tengensu and Third Eye, now instead of their existing effects, makes you take 20% more damage from the next attack, but if you are hit, you get the buff Chitin, which causes the next weapon skill to do 50% more damage. Both percentage values could be changed, but if you've seen what some samurai would do for 10 Kenki, imagine what they would do for 510 potency extra on their Tendo Zetsugeka. Yes, this would 100% make healers hate samurai. For Red Mage, Contra 6's cooldown is reduced by 2.5 seconds. Potency is slightly reduced to compensate. A core feature of Red Mage is that Flesh and Contra 6 do a lot of damage for being OGCDs, so it is crucially important for Red Mages to use them on cooldown. By design, their cooldowns, and basically all cooldowns in the game, are a multiple of 5 seconds, meaning that as long as Red Mage stays aligned so they finish a dual cast with Space to Weave Flesh or Contra 6, this happens naturally. Their melee combos spending an odd number of GCDs of time makes this a bit challenging. But making it so Flesh and Contra 6 naturally misalign with each other is going to be incredibly painful for the orderly among us, and also makes it harder to keep them in line, since you have to intentionally get them realigned early in the fight. Next is Gunbreaker. Heart of Corundum now costs a cartridge to use. Yes, very similar to the warrior thing, but it's so simple and I'd say it works. Or should I say, doesn't work. Even though the potency lost by losing 1 cartridge is probably less than losing 50 beast gauge, I can imagine Gunbreakers would feel a lot less inclined to use this just the same. Although, in a weird way, I could also see some Gunbreakers use Heart of Corundum in those awkward times where Solid Barrel at full cartridge is incoming for no mercy windows, so it might not be so bad. For Dancer, dance steps now only take half a second to resolve instead of a full second. However, now you cannot see what the correct dance moves are and simply have to guess until you have the full pattern. For those curious in the math Kai on this, assuming the order is completely random, it could take as little as 1 second, assuming no lag, to perform all the dance moves for standard step, if you guess right twice in a row, which would be half the time it takes currently. At worst, if we assume no dance move repeats, the worst case scenario for standard step would be 4, then 3 steps, which would take 3.5 seconds, nearly double the current time. For technical, the minimum time would be 2 seconds, which is half of current. The maximum would be 4, then 3, then 2, then 1 step, which would take 5 seconds, which is only slightly more than current. It would, however, require you to be really fast to mash through all the options, and it wouldn't add very much interesting gameplay as there is no way to guess the answer without just going left to right, essentially. For Reaper, Shadow of Death and Whirl of Death are no longer usable during Enshroud. The main thing this interacts with is the setup for double Enshrouds, which are a core part of optimizing Reaper. Without these options, you'd First of all, have to set up Death's Design leading up to the burst instead of doing it during Enshroud's startup. But if you still want to do double Enshroud, you would instead have to use either Harvest Moon or Harp, as all other options are cut off. Whether that is still worth it is an interesting conversation, since the Shadows of Death in double Enshroud are actions you would do anyway, you just choose to do them there. 2 Harp casts are not something you would do normally. Then for Sage. Cardia now jumps to a completely random party member every time it heals. The cooldown of Cardia is reduced to 1 second, so you can move it as much as you like. Cardia jumping completely randomly, not specifically to players that need healing, would in a similar way to Scholar's Ruining Change, mean that you have the ability to maximize the value of Cardia, but you have to control it fully manually on every GCD, or you lose out on potential healing. Just really, really annoying to deal with. For Viper, Serpent's Tail, Twin Fang and Twin Blood now all can be the button you need to press for the OGCD. All of the follow-up OGCDs, including Death Rattle, can now appear on any one of the 3 buttons, and pressing the wrong button leads to less damage. This would mean every time you finish a 1-2-3 combo, you have to look at which button lights up of the 3 and press that one. And you have about a second at most to process this without losing damage. Both coils, you need to figure out whether it's 1-2, 1-3, 2-3, 2-1, 3-1 or 3-2 to get maximum damage. Same for Uncoiled Fury. Oh yeah, there's also the 4 ones in Reawaken, I guess. Again, not too bad, but incredibly annoying to deal with, right? And finally for Pictomancer. You can now right-click off Subtractive Palette and Ether Hues again. However, a weird glitch in the implementation makes it so you can only right-click them off. Macros refuse to interact with them for some reason. Potency is also slightly adjusted, which happens to make the paint thinner Pictomancer slightly better. Initially, Pictomancers discovered that avoiding using Thunder and Magenta and such to make sure you generated more palette gauge was a slight damage gain, but led to a very janky rotation that involved manually removing the Subtractive Palette buff sometimes to forcibly exit the mode early to access Water and Blue instead of Thunder and Magenta, and removing Ether Hues so you could forcibly reset your combo to be in a slightly more favorable position. This was usually managed by using macros to remove these buffs, as manually clicking them off on a mouse, or if it is even possible or reliable to do at all on a controller, was very awkward. Imagine if you had access to this again, but now you can only do it in the most awkward way. But what do you think? How would you ruin your favorite, or alternatively most hated, jobs? Was I too nice? Or too evil? Are some of my ideas actually good things when it really comes to it? Be sure to let me know in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, the reason why Mage auto attacks seem to get weaker with each expansion appears to be a weird interaction with how much stats you need for a baseline value of the stat, combined with mages, healers, and DPS simply not gaining enough strength per level up. For example, if you need, say, 2.5 strength per level to go beyond the minimum amount like you see on secondary stats like crit, then dropping below 250 strength at level 100 would make your auto attacks do 1 damage. But being above that threshold would quickly add value.